Clara Bennett drove the blade of her kitchen knife into the floorboard at midnight and didn't flinch when it struck wood. Her fingers were still bleeding. She hadn't bothered wrapping them. She worked fast, prying up the plank, folding the letter until it was no larger than her palm, pressing it down into the dark space beneath. And she didn't hear Ethan Cole standing in the doorway until he spoke. "You gonna tell me what you're hiding down there, or am I supposed to pretend I didn't see it?" She froze. She hadn't heard a single footstep. Before we go any further, if this story already has its hooks in you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me. Now let's get back to Clara. She didn't answer him right away. That was the first thing Ethan noticed about Clara Bennett. She never answered anything right away. She had a way of going still when she was startled, the way a deer goes still in an open field, not fleeing yet, just measuring the distance between herself and danger. He stayed in the doorway. He didn't move toward her. He'd learned in the 3 weeks since she'd arrived at his ranch that moving toward Clara too fast was its own kind of mistake. Finally, she stood up from the floor. She pressed her bleeding fingers against her apron and looked at him directly, the way a woman looks at a man when she's deciding whether the truth will cost her more than a lie. "A letter," she said. "Just an old letter." "From who?" "Nobody important." Ethan looked at her hands. The blood was still coming. She hadn't even acknowledged it. He crossed the room, slowly took the lamp off the hook by the window, and set it on the table between them. In the better light, he could see the cut across her index finger was deep enough that it needed wrapping. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said sit down." She sat. Not because he'd ordered it. Clara Bennett didn't do anything because someone ordered it, but because her legs were shaking, and she was too tired to pretend otherwise. He pulled the cloth from his back pocket, the one he used for the horses, and without asking, he wrapped her hand and tied it tight. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the Montana wind was hammering the walls of the house. It was the kind of January cold that made men question their choices. Ethan had lived through 11 of these winters alone, and he had stopped questioning anything a long time ago. "The floorboard's loose," he finally said. "Third one from the window. Been meaning to fix it." Clara looked at him. "You knew," she said. "I know everything that happens in this house, Miss Bennett." She was quiet again. Then she said very carefully, "Then you know I'm not a threat to you." "I know that. And you know I work harder than any hand you've got." "I know that too." "Then why are you sitting here at midnight asking me about a letter?" Ethan leaned back in the chair. He was a big man, lean, not heavy, but the kind of lean that came from years of actual work rather than luck, and when he rested his arms on the table, the chair didn't make a sound. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, straight on, without flinching, without apology. "Because you've been hiding things in that floorboard for 2 weeks, he said. "And I figure whatever you're hiding is either going to bring trouble to my door or it ain't. If it ain't, I don't care. But if it is, I'd rather know now than find out when it's too late." Clara held his gaze. "It ain't going to bring trouble to your door." "You sure about that?" A beat. The wind screamed outside. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not sure about anything anymore." He nodded like that was the most honest thing she'd said since the night she arrived. And he stood up, pushed the chair in, and walked back toward his room without another word. At the door he paused. "Get some sleep, Miss Bennett." She didn't answer, because she never slept. She had arrived on the worst night of December. Ethan had been in this barn when he heard the gate latch rattle once, twice, then again, too weak to open it. He'd taken the lantern and walked out into the snow, expecting a stray animal, maybe a rider who'd lost his horse. What he found instead was a woman in a dark wool coat, one suitcase in her hand, the leather strap held together with a strip of fabric torn from the coat's hem, standing at his gate with the posture of someone who had already accepted that she might not be let in. She was thin. Not starving thin, but the kind of thin that comes from months of not resting of body and mind, burning through every reserve just to keep moving. Her gloves were dark at the knuckles, and it took him a moment to realize the darkness was dried blood. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said. Her voice was steady. He'd remember that later, how steady her voice was even then. "I'm looking for work. I can cook. I can keep accounts. I can manage a household. I don't require much pay. I only need a place to stay." Ethan looked at her. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. "East." "That's a wide answer." "It's the only one I have right now." He looked at the road behind her. No horse, no wagon, no one riding with her. Just the snow coming down in thick curtains and the dark spreading out in every direction for miles. "You walk here?" he asked. "From the Caldwell crossing. Stage left me when I couldn't pay the full fare." That was 7 miles. In a blizzard. He opened the gate. He told himself later it was because he needed a housekeeper. His last one had left in October, and the house had become something between a bunkhouse and a ruin. Dirty plates, cold stoves, laundry piling up in corners. He told himself it was practical. He told himself he'd have opened the gate for anyone in that condition. But the truth which he didn't examine closely was something he'd felt the moment she spoke. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition. The feeling of meeting someone who had learned to hold themselves together through sheer will, and seeing that same architecture in another person's face. He showed her to the small room off the kitchen. He set the spare lantern on the table and left her to it. The next morning she had the kitchen fire going before dawn, the bread already mixed, and 3 days' worth of dirty dishes scrubbed clean and stacked beside the window. Ethan's foreman, Holt, a barrel-chested man of 50 with a white beard and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years looking into the sun, stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at the clean surfaces like he'd walked into the wrong house. "Who in the—" he started. "New housekeeper," Ethan said, walking past him. "Where'd she come from?" "East." Holt looked at Clara, who was slicing bread without looking up. "Morning, ma'am." "Morning," Clara said. "You need anything?" "I need someone to tell me where you keep the account ledgers." Holt blinked. "The what now?" "The books. Financial records. I'll need to take inventory of what's in the pantry and cross it against what you've been spending. You've been paying twice the going rate for flour. I can see that from the receipts on that spike." She nodded toward the iron nail on the wall, where a mess of paper slips had been skewered. "I'll have a full accounting done by the end of the week." Holt turned to Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. "Ledgers are in the office," he said. "Top shelf." "Thank you," she said, and went back to slicing the bread. Sure. She didn't sleep. That much was clear from the first week. Ethan was a light sleeper, always had been, and his room was on the back side of the house close enough to the kitchen that he heard the stove being fed at 2 in the morning. He heard the chair scrape across the kitchen floor. He heard the soft, rhythmic sound of pencil against paper, the scratch and pause and scratch again of someone working through numbers. He got up the first night thinking something was wrong. He found her at the kitchen table with the account ledger, open a cup of tea, gone cold beside her hand, working by lamplight with the focused quiet of someone who had done this for years. She looked up when he appeared. "Go back to sleep, Mr. Cole," she said. "It's 2 in the morning." "I know what time it is." "You need rest." "I'll rest when the work is done." He looked at the ledger. Even from across the room he could see she'd filled 3 pages with her handwriting, neat tight columns, nothing wasted. He went back to bed. The same scene repeated every night for 2 weeks, and eventually he stopped checking. He simply accepted it. Clara Bennett worked through the night and moved through the daylight hours on something other than sleep. Coffee maybe, or iron will, or something she was running from that waited for her every time she closed her eyes. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. That was the arrangement. It was Holt who told him about the singing. "She goes to the barn," Holt said one morning, leaning in the stable doorway with his coffee. Around 11:30, every night. "I know," Ethan said. "You know." I said I know. Holt was quiet for a moment. What's she doing in there? Talking to the horses. Talking? Holt scratched his beard. Like, talking or singing, Ethan said. She sings to them. Holt absorbed this. Any particular reason? I didn't ask. You didn't ask. No. You're not even a little curious. Ethan looked at him. Holt? Yeah. Go fix the fence on the north pasture. Holt went, but Ethan was curious. He just didn't let himself act on it, because curiosity about Clara Bennett felt like the beginning of something he wasn't sure he was ready to open. He'd been closed for 11 years. Since Margaret died in the winter of '76, leaving him alone with the ranch and a grief so heavy it had eventually stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like weather, just part of the climate of his days. Something you moved through, not something you felt. Clara was the first person in 11 years who made the house feel like it had rooms instead of just walls. He wasn't ready to examine what that meant. The letters worried him more than anything else. He'd noticed the first one purely by accident. He'd been crossing the yard on a Thursday morning when he saw Clara coming from the direction of the road, not the barn, which was wrong, because there was nothing in that direction for half a mile, except the post box mounted on the fence post at the turnoff. She walked fast, the way she always walked, but her face was different, tighter. Whatever was in her hand, the folded paper, the envelope she pressed against her coat, like she was trying to push it through her own chest and into somewhere unreachable. That evening he heard the floorboard. He'd heard it the second time 4 days later, and then again the week after that. He said nothing. He watched the loose board near the window and said nothing, until the night he found her driving her knife into the wood at midnight, with bleeding hands hiding something fast and frantic in the way a person hides something they've been terrified someone will find. She ain't running from nothing small, he thought, lying in his bed afterward staring at the ceiling. A woman doesn't bleed for something small. He was in the barn early the next morning, checking the shoes on the mare, when Clara came in behind him. She set the bucket down by the stall, picked up the brush, and started working without preamble. They'd developed that between them, without discussion, working side by side in silence, comfortable with it, neither needing to fill the space. After a while she said, I want you to know something. Ethan kept his eyes on the mare's shoe. All right. Whatever is in that floorboard, it's not going to bring men to your door looking for trouble. I made sure of that. The letters come through a name that isn't mine. He didn't look up. That's so. Yes. Whose name? A pause. A woman I used to know in Chicago. She doesn't exist anymore. Neither does the name. He set the hoof down and stood up slowly, and now he looked at her. You running from someone, Miss Bennett? Clara kept brushing the horse. Her jaw was set. I'm running towards something, she said. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady, the way they always were, but there was something underneath that steadiness that he recognized. Something that was holding on by its fingernails. I had a daughter, she said. 5 years ago there was a fire. My house. Everyone was told she died in it. The barn went quiet, except for the horses shifting in their stalls. Everyone was told, he said. Not a question. The way she'd said it told him everything. She didn't die, Clara said. Her voice was completely flat, the way a voice goes flat when the emotion behind it is too large to let any of it show. I know she didn't die, and I've been trying to find proof of it for 2 years. The letters. She stopped. She looked at the horse's neck. Someone told me she's alive. Someone who was there. The letters are me trying to find out where she is. Ethan didn't say anything for a long time. Who has her? He finally asked. Clara's jaw tightened. Her father. Something cold moved through the room then. Not the January air, something else. The particular cold that comes with certain kinds of information, the kind that changes the shape of everything around it. He picked up his gloves from the rail and pulled them on one finger at a time, slow and deliberate. Her father, he repeated. Yes. And he's the reason you're here instead of Chicago." Clara set the brush down on the rail. She turned to face him fully, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let him see how tired she was. Not the tiredness of one sleepless night, or even 100 of them. The tiredness of a woman who had been surviving so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like not to be surviving. "I left him 4 years before the fire," she said. He has money, connections. He told everyone I abandoned our family, that I was unstable, that the fire was my fault." She stopped. "I ran because if I'd stayed, I would have been buried. Not by the fire, by him." Ethan looked at her. "His name?" he asked. "You don't need to know his name." "Miss Bennett." "Walter," she said. "His name is Walter Bennett." And then her composure cracked, just slightly, just for a moment, the way ice cracks when the temperature changes, and then holds together by sheer pressure. "He's a railroad man. He knows everyone worth knowing from here to Washington. And if he finds out where I am—" She stopped herself. She pressed her lips together and looked away. Ethan waited. "If he finds out," she finished quietly, "he'll use Ellie against me. He'll use her to bring me back. And I can't go back. I can't." The last word barely made it out of her mouth. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was just the sound of a woman at the bottom of what she could hold. Ethan stepped toward the barn door. Then he stopped, one hand on the post, and spoke without turning around. "Nobody rides onto this ranch uninvited," he said. "Nobody." He felt rather than heard her go still behind him. "Mr. Cole, you said you're running toward something," he said. "Then run toward it. You got a roof. You got a safe place to work. And you got my word that whatever you're hiding in that floorboard stays in that floorboard." He walked out of the barn. Behind him, he heard something he'd never heard from Clara Bennett before. Silence, and then the sound of a breath being exhaled that had been held for what sounded like a very long time. Shmong. That night around midnight, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. The kitchen was quiet. Clara wasn't working tonight, which was unusual. He could hear the wind outside. He could hear the horses faint and muffled through the walls. And then he heard her. Not working, not moving, not the careful, controlled sounds of a woman managing herself and everything around her. He heard her cry. Through the wall in the room off the kitchen, Clara Bennett was crying, the way people cry when they believe they are completely alone, without performance, without restraint. Just the raw, ragged sound of something breaking open that had been sealed for too long. And through it, in fragments, catching and stumbling, he heard her say it. "Ellie." The name came out broken. "Ellie, I'm coming. I swear to God I'm coming, baby. I didn't leave you. I didn't leave you." Ethan lay in the dark and didn't move. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. And then he did something he hadn't done in 11 years. He made a decision that had nothing to do with the ranch, nothing to do with practicality, nothing to do with any reason a sensible man could name. He made a decision based on the sound of a woman's voice saying her daughter's name in the dark, like a prayer she'd been saying so long she'd given up expecting an answer. He was going to help her find that little girl. He just hadn't figured out how to tell her yet. He didn't bring it up the next morning, or the morning after that. Ethan Cole had not survived 11 Montana winters by saying things before he knew how to say them right. He watched, and he waited, and he turned what he'd heard in the dark over in his mind, the way a man turns a stone in his hand, looking for the shape of it. Clara, for her part, moved through the following days with the same locked-down composure she always carried. She cooked. She managed the ledgers. She dealt with the supply merchants in town with a precision that made 2 of them visibly uncomfortable men who'd been overcharging Ethan Cole for years under the assumption that a rancher with money and no bookkeeper would never notice. She noticed. On the Friday of that week, she set the account ledger open on the kitchen table in front of Ethan and pointed to a column of figures without saying anything. He leaned over and looked. "That's the Hargrove bill," she said. "Feed and grain, November through December. You paid it. I always pay it. You paid it twice. Different invoice numbers, same delivery dates. She turned the ledger to face him fully. Hargrove's been running duplicate invoices on ranchers across this valley for at least 3 years based on what I found in your records. You're out $42 just in the last 2 months. Ethan straightened up slowly. You sure about that? I'm sure about numbers, Clara said. I'm always sure about numbers. He picked up his hat from the table. He put it on. He walked out the door. Holt, who had been pretending to examine a harness in the corner of the room, waited until Ethan's footsteps cleared the porch before he turned to Clara. He going to Hargrove's? I expect so, Clara said, and turned back to the ledger. Hargrove's a big man in town, got friends on the council. He's a thief, Clara said simply. Big men who are thieves still have to answer for arithmetic. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the harness down. Miss Bennett, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Where'd you learn accounting like that? She didn't look up. I worked for a firm in Chicago, before I was married. A pause. Before I stopped being allowed to work. Holt absorbed that carefully. I see, he said. Do you? I reckon I do, he said quietly, and picked up the harness again and went back to work. Ethan came back from town 2 hours later. He walked through the kitchen without stopping and set $42 on the table beside the ledger. Hargrove's refunding the Valley ranchers, he said. All of them. Clara looked at the money. He agreed to that. He agreed when I explained the alternative. What was the alternative? Ethan poured himself a cup of coffee. I didn't specify, but he filled in the blank just fine. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara almost smiled. It wasn't a full smile, more the shadow of one, the ghost of something warm that passed quickly and was gone. But Ethan caught it. He catalogued it without reaction, the way he catalogued everything, and tucked it somewhere he'd look at later when he was alone. That money's yours, he said. You found it. You earned it. It's yours. It came from your account. And your work found it. Take it. She didn't argue. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and something shifted in the room between them, something that hadn't been there before. A degree of trust that hadn't existed yesterday. Not large, but real. That night, for the first time, she wasn't in the kitchen at 2 a.m. He checked out of habit, found the room dark and quiet, and stood in the doorway for a moment before going back to bed. She was sleeping. He stood there longer than he needed to. The trouble started with a man named Greer. He rode into the yard on a Wednesday, which Ethan knew because Wednesdays were the days Clara did the weekly accounts review, which meant she was at the kitchen table with every receipt and ledger for the month spread out in front of her when Ethan heard hoofbeats in the yard and stepped outside. The man on the horse was lean and sharp-featured with the clothes of someone who wanted to look like a traveler and didn't quite manage it. His coat was too clean. His horse was too fresh. He hadn't been on the road long. Looking for the Cole Ranch, the man said. You found it, Ethan said. I'm looking for a woman. Goes by the name of Clara. Last name might be different, she changes it. He smiled, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Medium height, dark hair, about 30 years old. You seen anyone like that come through? Ethan looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking. Nope, he said. You sure I was told she came through this valley? I said, nope. Ethan's voice hadn't changed, same flat, dry tone it always had, but something in it made the man's horse shift sideways. You want something else, or are you done? The man studied him. Who should I say I spoke to if anyone asks? Nobody asked, Ethan said, and nobody will. The man turned his horse and rode back toward the road without another word. Ethan watched him go until the sound of hoofbeats died out completely. Then he turned and went inside. Clara was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard. Her face had gone to stone. How long? Ethan asked. I don't know, she said. I was careful. I was so careful. Description matched you. I know. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe. Greer. That was Greer. He's one of Walter's men. He finds people. She stopped. He found me in St. Louis. He found me in Kansas City. I always had a few days warning before Walter arrived, but now, how many days? She looked at him. The composure was there, but it was strained now like a rope pulled past its capacity. Last time 3. Then we've got 3 days, Ethan said. We. She said the word like she wasn't sure she'd heard it right. He pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down. Sit. She sat. Tell me everything, he said. All of it. Not the safe version, everything. So, she talked for 2 hours. He didn't interrupt. He sat with his coffee and he listened, the way he'd always listened, completely without performance, without the kind of nodding and murmuring that most people do to show they're paying attention, but that usually means they're just waiting for their turn. He was actually listening. Every word, every pause. Walter Bennett. She told him was the kind of man who understood that power worked best when it was invisible. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten directly. He constructed situations, legal, financial, social, in which other people made the choices he wanted them to make, and he stood far enough back that none of it could be traced to him. He'd been doing it since before she married him. She'd thought when she married him in 1876 that she was marrying a businessman. She had. What she hadn't understood was that his business included her respectability, her social connections, her willingness to stand beside him at functions and smile, and never contradict what he said in company. When she contradicted him in private, the consequences had been quiet and precise, and nothing that left a mark anyone else could see. I left in 1882, she said. I took Ellie and I left. I had $12 and a contact in Milwaukee who could forge travel papers. She stopped. He found me in 3 weeks. He took Ellie. He told me if I made any noise, any at all, he'd have me committed. He had a doctor. He had a judge. He had everything arranged. Her voice stayed level. It had the flat sound of a story that had been survived rather than lived. He said Ellie would be raised to believe her mother had abandoned them, that she'd be told I was sick, dangerous. A beat. That I didn't love her. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. The fire was 1883, Clara continued. It started in the kitchen, Walter's house. I wasn't there. I was in the servants' quarters behind the property. They told me afterward that the main house had burned and that Ellie hadn't survived. She pressed her lips together. I believed it for 6 months. 6 months I believed she was dead, and that it was my fault for not being there, for leaving her in that house with him. But she wasn't dead, Ethan said. No. Clara folded her hands on the table. A woman named Ruth. She was a laundress. She'd worked in that house for years. She found me last spring. She sent a letter through channels Walter couldn't trace. She told me she'd seen Ellie after the fire, that Walter had moved her to a property in Colorado, that he'd told everyone the child had died to cut off any claim I might make. She looked at Ethan directly. He faked my daughter's death so that no one would ever look for her, so I could never use her as a reason to involve the law. The kitchen was very quiet. The letters under the floorboard, Ethan said. Ruth's letters, and mine going back. She's been trying to find out exactly where Ellie is, which property, who's with her. Clara's hands tightened on the table. I'm close. I'm closer than I've ever been. That's why I came this far west. Ruth's last letter said Colorado Northern Territory. Montana was the closest safe ground I could find. Ethan looked at her hands. The knuckles were white. How old is she? He asked. Clara's voice changed. Not much. Just enough. 7, she said. She'll be 7 in March. He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there, with his back to her, looking out at the yard, the road, the snow. Greer's going to report back to Walter, he said. Walter's going to be here inside a week. I know. You want to run again? A long silence. No, Clara said. I'm tired of running. He turned around. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not fear, not composure, not the practiced blankness she wore like armor. Something rawer than that. Something that had stopped pretending. "Then we don't run," he said. "Mr. Cole." "Ethan." She stopped. "My name is Ethan," he said. "You've been here a month. Call me by my name." Something moved through her face that she didn't control quite fast enough. He saw it and said nothing. "Ethan," she said, "you don't know what Walter is capable of." "No," he agreed. "But he doesn't know what I am either." They had 2 days before everything changed. Those 2 days had the quality of a held breath, both of them moving through the routine of the ranch with the awareness of people who knew the clock was running. Clara finished the monthly accounts. Ethan quietly had 2 conversations, one with his foreman and one with a man in town whose name he didn't share with Clara. And something in the way the men on the ranch began positioning themselves always within sight of the road, always with a reason to be where they were told Clara he was preparing without announcing it. She didn't ask him to stop. On the second evening, she found him in the barn after supper. He was checking the horses, not from necessity, just the way he always did in the evenings, running his hands along their necks, checking their feet, talking to them in a low, continuous murmur that she'd heard before through the barn walls, but never close enough to make out. She stood at the entrance. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He didn't stop working. "Ask." "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Doing what?" "You know what." She stepped into the barn. "You don't know me. I showed up at your gate with blood on my hands and no story, and you let me in, and now you're—" She stopped. "You're standing between me and a man who has destroyed everyone who tried to stand between him and what he wants. Why?" Ethan straightened up. He turned around and looked at her, and whatever she expected him to say, what came out wasn't it. "I had a daughter," he said. The barn went still. "She was 2 months old," he said. "Her and Margaret both. Winter of '76. Fever went through the valley that year." He pulled his gloves on slowly. "I spent a year after that being angry at everything and everybody and nothing. Just angry because angry was the only thing big enough to fill the space." He looked at the horse's neck. "Eventually it ran out. You can only be that angry for so long before it just turns into quiet." He looked back at her. "What I'm saying is, I know what it is to have something taken that nobody had the right to take. And I know what it looks like when someone else knows that same thing." Clara stood very still. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About your wife. About your daughter." "I know you are." A beat. "Ellie's going to know you," he said. "Whatever it takes. She's going to know her mother didn't leave her." Clara's chin lifted slightly. She pressed her lips together and held them there for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady, but only barely. "You can't promise that." "No," he agreed. "But I can make it more likely." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight, and then she nodded once, small and tight, the way she did everything without excess, and turned back toward the house. She was halfway across the yard when he called after her. "Miss Bennett." She stopped. "You said you're running toward something," he said. "Stop running. Start planning. There's a difference and you know it." She didn't turn around, but she stood there for a moment in the cold and the dark, and something in the line of her shoulders shifted something that had been braced for years, pulled tight against the next blow, releasing by a degree so small it was almost nothing. Almost. She walked back to the house. At the kitchen table, she opened the ledger, but she didn't look at the numbers. She stared at the blank page at the back, the clean, unmarked page at the end, and after a long moment, she picked up her pencil and began to write. Not accounts, not figures. Names, dates, documents she remembered. Testimony Ruth had given her in letters. The invoice numbers on receipts from Walter's railroad company that she'd memorized years ago, because she'd understood even then that paper was the only weapon a woman in her position was ever going to be allowed to use. She wrote for 3 hours. When she finally set the pencil down, she had 11 pages. It wasn't enough to convict Walter Bennett. Not yet. But it was enough to start. And for the first time in 4 years, Clara Bennett felt something other than fear about the future. She felt the particular cold clarity that comes to a person when they stop surviving and start fighting. Outside, past the dark yard and the sleeping horses, she heard the gate latch rattle in the wind. She looked up. She listened. Nothing. Just the wind. She picked up her pencil and kept writing. The gate latch hadn't been the wind. She knew it the next morning when Holt came into the kitchen before sunrise and didn't pour himself coffee. Holt always poured himself coffee. The absence of it told her everything before he opened his mouth. "Riders on the South Road," he said. "4 of them, maybe 5. Moving slow like they want to be seen." Clara set down her pencil. "How far?" she asked. "Hour, maybe less." She stood up. She went to the window, not to look. She knew there was nothing to see from there, but because she needed to move, and the window was the only direction that made sense. Her hands were flat on the table. Her breathing was controlled. Inside her chest, something was happening that she refused to let onto her face. "Where's Ethan?" she asked. "Already knows. He's in the yard." She took her apron off. She folded it once, set it on the table, and walked outside. Ethan was standing at the fence with his back to the house looking south. He had his coat on, and his hat low, and his hands loose at his sides, and he looked exactly the way he always looked, like a man who had decided something, and finished deciding it, and wasn't interested in revisiting the decision. "You should go inside," he said without turning around. "No," Clara said. "Clara, no." She came to stand beside him. "I've been going inside for 4 years. I'm done going inside." He looked at her then. She met his eyes and held them, and whatever he saw there made him nod once and turn back to the road. They waited. The riders came into sight 10 minutes later, 4 men on horseback, and a 5th figure in a carriage that rolled behind them. The carriage was black and expensive, and wrong for a Montana ranch road in January, and Clara recognized it before she could see the man inside. She recognized the way it moved, the particular self-important slowness of something built to be watched. "That's him," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. It took everything she had, but her voice didn't shake. Egg. Walter Bennett stepped out of the carriage like a man arriving at a business meeting he'd already won. He was tall and well-dressed and carried himself with the particular ease of someone who'd never once had to consider whether a room would receive him. His face was handsome, in the way of men who'd always been told, so smooth, careful, accustomed to the effect it produced. He looked at Clara and smiled. "My darling," he said, "you look well." "Walter," she said, "I've been looking for you for quite some time." "I know." He glanced at Ethan beside her, measuring him the way he measured everything for usefulness or obstacle, nothing in between. "Mr. Cole," he said pleasantly, "I appreciate you sheltering my wife. It's been a difficult situation for everyone." "She ain't your wife," Ethan said. "In the eyes of the law." "In the eyes of the law, she left you," Ethan said. 4 years ago. I believe that's documented." Walter's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Not quite," he said. "The documentation tells a more complicated story, as these things do." He looked back at Clara. "I've come a long way. I think we should talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Clara said. "I think there is." He turned back to the carriage, and then he opened the door, and the little girl stepped out. Cure. The world stopped. That was the only way Clara would ever describe it afterward. The world simply stopped like a clock whose spring had finally run out, and for one suspended moment, there was nothing. No cold, no wind, no Walter, no Ethan, no ranch, no years of running. Just a small girl with dark eyes and Clara's own chin and a red wool coat 2 sizes too big, standing beside the carriage wheel and looking at the woman she'd been told had left her. "Ellie," Clara breathed. The little girl didn't move. Her face was unreadable in the way children's faces become when they've been told something that hurts and they don't know yet whether they believe it. Clara took 1 step forward. "Don't," Walter said. She stopped. Her hands were shaking now. She was not proud of that. She couldn't stop it. "She doesn't know you," Walter said, and his voice was gentle, which was the most dangerous thing about him, how gentle his voice was when he was destroying something. "I told her the truth about what happened, that you left, that the fire was difficult for all of us." "You lied to her," Clara said. The shaking was in her voice now too, but it wasn't fear. It wasn't. "You told her I was dead." "I told her you were gone," Walter said smoothly. Which was true. "Walter." Clara's voice dropped to something very quiet and very precise. "I will burn every lie you've built to the ground. Every one of them. I have documentation. I have testimony. I have 11 pages of—" "You have nothing," he said, still pleasant, still gentle. "You have the word of a woman who abandoned her family and a laundress with no credibility, against a man with a senator's endorsement and a judge in every county from here to Denver." He tilted his head slightly. "Come home, Clara. Come home and Ellie grows up knowing her mother. That's the offer. It's the only offer." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had ever heard. He watched Clara's face. He watched the moment the offer landed, and the moment she began almost imperceptibly to consider it not because she wanted to, but because she was a mother, and a mother will walk into any fire if it means her child gets out. He stepped forward. "The answer is no," he said. Walter looked at him with the patience of a man who has never once been told no by someone he considered beneath him. "Mr. Cole, I understand you've become invested in my wife's situation, but I'd caution you." "My caution's doing fine," Ethan said. "Your offer's the problem. You're asking a woman to give up her freedom to buy back what you stole from her. That ain't a bargain. That's extortion. And extortion's a federal offense. As is," Walter said, his voice cooling by a degree, "harboring a woman who has active legal proceedings against her." "What proceedings?" Clara said sharply. Walter reached into his coat. He produced a folded document and held it out. "Abandonment. Moral unfitness. Signed by Judge Harlan Morse of the Colorado Territory." He looked at her steadily. "You come home, these go away. You stay, they don't." Clara stared at the document. Her face had gone absolutely still. Ethan watched her. He watched the exact moment she made her decision. And he watched the exact moment her eyes went to Ellie, still standing by the carriage wheel, watching her mother with those dark eyes that were her mother's eyes, and hardened into something he recognized. Not defeat. Not surrender. The particular hardening of a woman who has decided she can withstand anything as long as the thing she loves most is standing on the other side of it. "All right," Clara said. "Clara," Ethan said. "All right," she said again louder. "To Walter, I'll come." "No," Ethan said, flat, final. He stepped in front of her. Walter's riders shifted in their saddles. One of them, the lean one, Greer, the one who'd come to the ranch 3 days earlier, moved his horse 2 steps forward. His hand was near his coat. Ethan didn't look at Greer. He kept his eyes on Walter. "You're not taking her anywhere tonight." "Mr. Cole," I said, "you're not taking her anywhere." His voice had dropped. It was the voice he used when a conversation was over. "You rode onto my property with armed men and a forged court order." "It isn't forged. Judge Harlan Morse died in October," Ethan said. "His name's been in the territorial papers twice since then. Once for the funeral, once for the estate settlement." He looked at Walter's face and watched something move behind the careful pleasantness there. The first crack, small but real. "So I'll say it again. The document is forged. The offer is extortion." And if any one of your men touches a woman on my property, they'll answer to me personally, and then to a federal marshal in whatever order they prefer." Dead silence. Walter looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at Ellie. And then, with the smooth deliberateness of a man who is changing tactics rather than retreating, he smiled. "We'll stay the night," he said. "The girl's tired. I'm sure Mr. Cole can accommodate us." He gestured to his riders. "We'll speak again in the morning when everyone's had time to think clearly." They put Walter and Ellie in the guest room, and the riders in the bunkhouse, which put Holt in the bunkhouse with 4 of Walter's men and a level of tension that didn't need explaining. Ethan had a quiet word with 2 of his own hands before supper. Clara watched the exchange without being able to hear it, and from the way both men nodded and moved differently afterward, she understood what he'd said even without the words. She found him in the kitchen afterward alone. "The document," she said. "How did you know about Judge Morse?" "I didn't," he said. "Until yesterday. I sent a wire to the territorial office." She stared at him. "When? Day after Greer came to the yard." "You." She stopped. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him more and more lately, like he kept being something she hadn't prepared for. "You were already building a case. I was already preparing," he said. "There's a difference." He glanced toward the hallway. "How's Ellie?" Clara's expression did something complicated. "She won't look at me. She doesn't know you yet. She used to know me." Her voice was very quiet. "She used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. She used to call me—" She stopped. He's had 4 years to tell her who I am. 4 years of his version of me. She pressed her hand flat against the wall. "I don't know how to undo 4 years in one night." "You don't," Ethan said. "You don't undo it in one night. You just have to be the truth for long enough that his lies stop making sense." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the floor, turning his coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was saying something he'd thought through carefully and wasn't sure how it would land. "She has your eyes," he said. "I noticed that the minute I saw her." Clara couldn't speak for a moment. "Go sit with her," he said. "Don't explain anything. Don't defend yourself. Just sit with her." She went. The house was quiet by 10 o'clock, which was when Walter came out of the guest room. Ethan was in the kitchen. He'd known Walter would come. Men like Walter didn't sleep when things weren't resolved on their terms. He'd made coffee, and he was sitting at the table with Clara's 11 pages in front of him, reading through them for the 3rd time. Walter stopped when he saw the pages. Something happened to his face. "Where did you get those?" he said. "Woman who lives in this house wrote them," Ethan said. "From memory. Dates, amounts, invoice numbers. 3 different railroad contracts with forged land surveys attached." He turned a page. "Names of at least 2 other women who went through what she went through. One of them still in Colorado. One of them's in Chicago." He looked up. "Any of this sounding familiar?" Walter crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed for the pages. Ethan's hand came down flat on the stack. "Sit down." Walter froze. Nobody had spoken to him like that in 30 years, maybe ever. The shock of it held him in place for one long second, and then something shifted behind his eyes. The pleasantness dropped entirely, and what was underneath it was exactly what Clara had described. Not loud, not dramatic. Precise. Controlled. The face of a man who decided outcomes and was not accustomed to variables. "You're making a mistake," Walter said softly. "Wouldn't be my first," Ethan said. "I have the kind of connections that can make a ranch like this disappear," Walter said. "Liens, tax disputes, railroad easements. I can have this property tied up in legal proceedings for 20 years. "You can try," Ethan said. "I'm not threatening. I'm informing. I understood you this first time." Ethan leaned back in the chair. "Here's what I'm informing you of. Those 11 pages go to the federal marshal's office in Helena tomorrow morning. I've got a man riding at dawn." He watched Walter's face. "Now, the marshal's office has been looking for something to stick on the Bennett Railroad interests for about 3 years. Something about land acquisitions in the northern corridor that didn't quite add up. He tilted his head slightly. You want to tell me if any of those acquisitions showed up in Clara's memory? Walter's jaw tightened. Page 7, Ethan said. Third paragraph. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Walter looked at the pages under Ethan's hand. He looked at the door. He looked at the hallway that led to the guest room where Clara had been sitting with Ellie for the past hour. He made a decision. Ethan saw it coming half a second before it happened, the shift in weight. The hand moving toward the coat, and he was on his feet when Walter pulled the revolver and leveled it across the kitchen table. I'm leaving tonight, Walter said, with my wife and my daughter, and you are going to sit in that chair. Walter? Both men turned. Clara was standing in the hallway door. She'd heard everything, and she was not alone. Behind her, one small hand wrapped around her mother's fingers. For the first time in 4 years stood Ellie. The little girl looked at her father across the kitchen with her mother's eyes, and something in those eyes, something that had no name and no calculation behind it, made Walter's gun hand waver by the smallest degree. It was enough. Clara stepped forward. Put it down, Walter, she said. Clara, I said put it down. Her voice was the steadiest thing in the room, steadier than the gun, steadier than the man holding it. Because if you pull that trigger, every person in this house is a witness, and every witness is a nail in the case that's going to Helena tomorrow morning, and you know that you cannot afford that case. Walter's eyes moved from her to Ethan to the pages on the table. The calculation ran behind his face like water finding a crack. You think a woman's memory is going to hold up against page 7? Clara said. Invoice number 4471-B. The Clearwater Land Survey, September 1881. You paid a surveyor named Amos Fitch $400 to falsify the eastern boundary by 3 miles. Amos Fitch is still alive, Walter. He's still in Denver, and he's been wanting to clear his conscience for 2 years. She took one more step forward. Put the gun down. The gun stayed up. For 5 seconds that lasted an hour. Nothing in the room moved. And then Ellie said very quietly, in a voice so small it barely filled the space between them. Mama. Walter looked at his daughter, and in the moment he looked at her, Ethan moved. The gun went off. Not at Ethan, not at Clara. The shot went into the ceiling when Ethan's hand came down on Walter's wrist and twisted hard, and the sound of it in that small kitchen was like a crack of thunder. In a closed room. Ellie screamed. Clara spun toward her daughter, and Walter hit the kitchen floor with Ethan on top of him before the echo had finished dying. It was over in 4 seconds. 4. Holt appeared in the back doorway 30 seconds after that, rifle in hand, with 2 of Ethan's men behind him. He took in the scene, Walter face down on the kitchen floor, Ethan with one knee in the man's back, and his hand pinning both wrists, and lowered the rifle with the calm of a man who had seen worse on a slow Tuesday. Need anything? Holt asked. Rope, Ethan said. Got it right here. Clara was already across the room on her knees in front of Ellie, her hands on the little girl's face, checking her eyes, ears, hands, the way mothers check children after a loud noise, the fast instinctive inventory of harm. I'm all right, Ellie said. Her voice was very small. Mama, I'm all right. Neither of them noticed right away what Ellie had just said. Then Clara went very still. Ellie was looking at her with those dark eyes, her mother's eyes wide and frightened, and completely certain in the way children are certain about things they know in their bodies before they know them in their minds. Mama, Ellie said again, steadier this time, like she was testing the word and finding it fit exactly where it belonged. Clara pulled her daughter into her arms and held on. She didn't cry. She'd done her crying already in the dark in the room off the kitchen into the Montana cold where she'd thought no one could hear. What she did instead was press her face into Ellie's hair and breathe and hold and not let go. Ethan looked at them from across the room. He looked at Walter on the floor. He looked at his hands. And then he stood up, stepped over Walter Bennett like he was furniture, and walked outside to get some air. Why? The federal marshal arrived from Helena 2 days later. Ethan had sent the wire the morning after the confrontation, along with Clara's 11 pages and a signed statement from Holt and both ranch hands who'd been present. The marshal was a compact, weathered man named Aldous Cray, who had the eyes of someone who'd heard every version of every story and was no longer surprised by any of them. He read Clara's documentation at the kitchen table while she sat across from him, and Walter sat in the locked storeroom under Holt's supervision. Marshal Cray read without expression. He turned pages. He went back twice, once to page 3, once to page 7. He set the stack down and looked at Clara. "The surveyor," he said. "Amos Fitch. You certain he's still in Denver?" "As of 6 months ago," Clara said. "I have a letter." "I'll need that letter." She produced it from her apron pocket. She'd been carrying it since the night she'd moved it from the floorboard. He took it, read it, folded it carefully. "This is substantial," he said. "I know it is. There'll be a hearing. Territorial court in Helena. You'll have to testify." Clara's jaw tightened. "I know. It won't be easy. His lawyers will come at your character, your history, the abandonment claim that ye." "Marshal Cray," Clara said. "I've been surviving Walter Bennett for 12 years. I think I can manage his lawyers." The marshal looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I reckon you can." He stood up and went to collect Walter. Walter walked through the kitchen without looking at Clara. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his jaw set, his posture as composed as a man in handcuffs could manage. At the door, he stopped. "You'll regret this," he said, still not looking at her. "When the lawyers are done with you, you won't have a name left." "I don't need your name," Clara said. "I never did." He walked out. She listened to the sound of the marshal's wagon leaving the yard, and when it was gone, she put both hands flat on the table and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the center of her chest. Ethan came in from the yard. "He's gone," he said. "I know." She looked up. "Thank you." He shook his head. "Don't thank me for that," he said. "That wasn't for me to be thanked for." She looked at him across the kitchen, at the man who'd opened his gate in a blizzard, who'd read a forged court document by lamplight, who'd pinned a railroad magnet to his kitchen floor at midnight, and never once asked her what it was worth to him. And she didn't have words for what she felt, so she didn't try to find them. She simply said, "Stay for supper." And Ethan, who had lived alone in this house for 11 years, sat down at the kitchen table like he'd been invited somewhere he'd been trying to find for a very long time. The hearing in Helena was set for the first week of March. In the 6 weeks between Walter's arrest and the hearing, the ranch changed. Not in any dramatic way, not all at once. But Ethan noticed it the way you notice weather changing in small accumulations that build until you look up one morning and realize the season has shifted entirely. Ellie was the loudest evidence of it. She'd been quiet the first few days, the watchful quiet of a child recalibrating everything she'd been told against everything she was experiencing. She followed Clara at a distance, and then a closer distance, and then no distance at all. She sat beside her mother at breakfast and asked questions with the relentless precision of a 7-year-old. "Where did you go? Why did you go? Did it hurt? Did you think about me? What does Montana snow taste like? Can horses understand English?" Clara answered every question, even the ones that cost her, especially those. On the 4th morning, Ellie appeared at the kitchen table while Ethan was having coffee and Clara was making bread, and she climbed up onto the chair across from him and studied him with her mother's direct, unblinking gaze. "Are you in love with my mother?" she asked. Ethan choked on his coffee. Clara's shoulders from across the kitchen went rigid. He set the cup down. He looked at the 7-year-old across the table, who was watching him with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use it. "That's a complicated question," he said. "Mama says complicated is just another word for something people don't want to answer," Ellie said. A sound came from the direction of the bread dough. It might have been a cough. It was almost certainly not a cough. Ethan looked at Ellie. "Your mama's a smart woman," he said. I know. Ellie picked up his coffee cup, sniffed it, put it back. She said you were the one who kept her safe. She kept herself safe, Ethan said. I just made sure nobody got in the way. Ellie considered this with the gravity it deserved. That sounds like the same thing to me. Maybe it is, he said. Maybe it ain't. Do you want it to be? He looked at her for a long moment. You always ask questions like that. Mama says the only stupid question is the one you don't ask. Your mama says a lot of smart things. I know. Ellie looked at him steadily. You didn't answer. From across the kitchen, Clara had gone very still. The bread dough was not being kneaded anymore. Ethan picked up his coffee cup. He looked into it. He set it back down. Yeah, he said quietly. I reckon I do. The kitchen was silent for 3 full seconds. Then Ellie nodded, apparently satisfied, and got down from the chair and went to help her mother with the bread. Ethan did not look at Clara. Clara did not look at him. But her hands, when she started working the dough again, were not entirely steady. Gag. The hearing lasted 3 days. On the first day, Walter's lawyers did exactly what Marshall Cray had warned. They came at Clara's credibility, with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, her history of abandonment, her mental instability as documented by Walter's physician, the gaps in her account that couldn't be verified by any witness with social standing. Clara sat in the witness chair and answered every question with the flat, precise accuracy of a woman who had been memorizing numbers for 12 years, specifically for this moment. On the second day, Amos Fitch arrived from Denver. He was a thin, gray-haired man of 62 who walked with a cane and sat in the witness chair like he'd been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally found a place to set it down. He confirmed every figure on page 7, every invoice, every falsified boundary, every payment made to him by Walter Bennett's railroad company between 1880 and 1884 to ensure that land surveys in the Northern Corridor reflected what Walter needed them to reflect rather than what the land actually was. Walter's lead lawyer objected 14 times. The judge sustained 3 of them. The rest landed. On the third day, Ruth came. Clara hadn't known she was coming. She looked up from the witness table and saw the woman she'd known only through letters, stout, dark-haired, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard for every year of her life, walking into the courtroom and taking a seat in the gallery. And something in Clara's chest simply broke open and rearranged itself. Ruth testified about the fire, about Ellie's survival, about the night Walter had moved the child 2 days after the blaze before the investigation was complete, about what he'd told the household staff, and what he'd threatened them with if they said otherwise. The courtroom was silent in the way courtrooms go silent, when something true has been said that cannot be unsaid. Clara sat at the table with her hands folded and her face composed and tears running down her face that she didn't try to stop because stopping them would have cost her something she needed for what came next. When the third day ended, the judge called a recess. He didn't need long. Walter Bennett was convicted on 7 counts of document fraud, 2 counts of land survey falsification, and 1 count of custodial interference. His railroad contracts in the Northern Corridor were suspended pending federal investigation. His lawyers immediately filed for appeal, which was their right and their job, and they did it with efficiency and confidence and the certainty of men who believed this was a setback, not an ending. They were wrong about that, but none of them knew it yet. Clara walked out of the Helena courthouse into the cold March air and stood on the steps and breathed. Just breathed. The kind of breathing a person does when they've been underwater for a long time and have finally broken the surface. Ethan was at the bottom of the steps. He'd been there for all 3 days. He sat in the gallery every morning and left when she left and said very little because she didn't need words from him. She needed presence. And presence was something Ethan Cole had always been better at than words. She came down the steps and stood in front of him. "It's not over," she said. "The appeal. I know. His lawyers are good. I know. This could go on for years. I know." He looked at her steadily. "You planning to run?" Something moved through her face. "No," Then it doesn't matter how long it goes on, he said. You've got ground under your feet now. That's different from before. She looked at him. At the man who'd stood beside her through 3 days of being publicly taken apart and put back together and taken apart again, who'd said almost nothing and been precisely what she needed. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask. The morning after I arrived, when you opened the gate. She paused. Why did you really do it? He was quiet for a moment. Because you were standing in the snow with blood on your hands, he said, and you didn't ask for anything except work and a place to sleep. He looked at her. And I'd spent 11 years in a house big enough for a family alone, and I thought... He stopped. He looked away, then back. I thought that seemed like something I could help with. Clara held his gaze for a long time. It was... she said quietly. He nodded. Behind them, the courthouse door opened, and Ellie came running out with the speed of a child who had been sitting still for 3 days and had reached her absolute limit. She came down the steps and hit her mother at full speed and wrapped both arms around Clara's waist and pressed her face into her coat. Is it done? She demanded. Can we go home? Clara looked at Ethan over her daughter's head. Home. The word sat there between them, and neither of them moved to pick it up, because picking it up meant acknowledging what it meant, and they weren't quite ready for that yet. But they were close. Closer than either of them had been to anything in a very long time. Yeah, baby, Clara said, her hand going to Ellie's hair. We can go home. She took her daughter's hand, and the three of them walked toward the wagon in the March cold, and nobody said anything else for a while. And the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that has found its shape and is content to hold it. Spring came to the coal ranch in stages the way it always did in Montana, grudgingly at first, then all at once. The mud came first, then the grass, then the sound of Ellie's voice at full volume, carrying across the yard from wherever she'd gotten to, which changed by the hour. She had decided she liked horses, which meant she spent most mornings in the barn making friends with the mare and asking Holt questions he didn't always know how to answer. Holt bore this with the patience of a man who had not had a child on the property in 11 years and had apparently been waiting for one without knowing it. Clara managed the books, negotiated a better contract with the feed supplier in town, and had a quiet conversation with a woman named Agnes Harrow, who arrived at the ranch gate in April with 2 children and a bruise she'd tried to cover with her collar. Ethan opened the gate before Clara had to ask. She looked at him. He shrugged. I learned from someone, he said. Agnes and her children stayed in the east room. Then another woman came in. May, sent by a preacher in the next valley who'd heard about the coal ranch in the way that useful information travels by word of mouth quietly among people who need it. The ranch that had housed one silent man for 11 years was learning slowly a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes after noise, after fighting, after the particular exhaustion of survival finally giving way to something else. One evening in late May, Ethan found Clara in the barn after supper. She was with the mare, as she often was, her hand on the horse's neck, not singing tonight, just standing there in the lamplight, with the calm of someone who has learned what it costs to be at peace and is choosing it anyway. He leaned against the stall door. Ruth's coming in June, Clara said without turning around. I wrote to her last week. She wants to meet Ellie properly. Good, he said. And the marshal's office sent a letter. The appeal's been denied. He straightened. When? Yesterday. She turned then, and her face in the lamplight was something he hadn't seen before. Not the managed composure, not the controlled steadiness. Just her. Just Clara. It's over. The convictions stand. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara, he said. Ethan. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and put his hands on her face and looked at her the way a man looks at someone he's been watching from a careful distance for too long, and she looked back at him without moving away, without the careful measurement she usually applied to everything. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly. In case that's what you were about to ask. I wasn't, he said. Then what were you going to say? He thought about it. Thank you, he said, for staying. She put her hand over one of his and held it there. Thank you, she said, for opening the gate. Outside across the yard, Ellie's voice carried through the evening air, calling something to Holt that made the old man's laughter follow it, big and warm, and completely unguarded, the laugh of a man who had forgotten he knew how. The mare shifted in the stall, the lamplight held steady, and in the barn on the coal ranch, in the last light of a Montana evening, two people who had both learned the hard way what it cost to be broken stood close enough to share the warmth of it and let themselves believe for the first time in a very long time that what was broken could become something else entirely. Ruth arrived on a Tuesday in June on the afternoon stage from Billings with a carpetbag in each hand and the expression of a woman who had spent 20 years watching other people's lives from a careful distance and had finally decided to live her own. Ellie met her at the gate. She'd been watching the road since morning, stationed at the fence post, with the single-minded focus of a child who has been told something important is coming and intends to be the first one to see it. When the wagon turned up the road, she was already running before it stopped. Ruth climbed down and caught her, and the sound that came out of Ruth, part laugh, part sob, the sound of a woman holding a child she'd carried across 4 years of fear to deliver safely into the right pair of hands, was the kind of sound that carries. Clara heard it from the porch. She stood there and watched her daughter in Ruth's arms and pressed her fingers against her mouth and held herself together by the thinnest thread. Ethan came out of this house behind her. He stood at her shoulder, not touching her, not saying anything. Just there. She's the reason Ellie's alive, Clara said quietly. I know. She risked everything. She had nothing to gain. Some people are built that way, he said. Clara looked at him sideways. So are you, she said. He didn't answer, but she saw his jaw shift the way it did when something landed and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it. He didn't. He went down the porch steps to help Ruth with her bags, and Clara watched him go with the particular expression she'd been wearing more and more lately, the one she hadn't quite named yet, because naming it would make it real and real things could still be taken. She was working on that, the believing part. The allowing herself to have something, without bracing for the moment it disappeared. She was working on it every day. Moll. Ruth stayed a week, which turned into 2, which turned into a conversation at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening that none of them had planned. It started with Agnes. Agnes Harrow had been at the ranch for 2 months by then, steady and quieter than she'd been at the beginning. Her children filling the east wing of the house with a noise that Ethan bore with the forbearance of a man who had decided it was a good problem to have. She'd been helping Clara with the accounts, which turned out to be something she was better at than either of them had expected. And she'd started writing letters on behalf of 2 other women in the valley that Clara knew about, and Ethan was only learning about. There are more, Agnes said at that Sunday table. Ruth looked up from her tea. More women? Clara asked. In this valley alone, I know of 4. 2 of them have children. One of them's been to the doctor twice this year for injuries, her husband explained away. Agnes's voice was flat and factual. She'd learned from watching Clara that flatness was not coldness. It was precision. It was how you said the unbearable things without losing the thread. They need somewhere to go. Right now there's nowhere. The table was quiet. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan was looking at the tabletop, turning his coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was thinking past the thing being said to the shape of what it meant. The north bunkhouse, he said finally. Everyone looked at him. It's been empty since Calhoun left in March. Needs work, but the bones are solid. He looked up. 2 families could fit comfortable, 3 if they don't mind close quarters. Clara said very carefully, You understand what you're saying. I understand what I'm saying. This would change the ranch, what it is, what it's known for. It already has, he said. And the way he said it, the simple directness of it, no performance, no grand statement, was more than any speech would have been. You've been running it for 6 months, Clara. This is already what it is. I'm just saying out loud what it's been. Agnes looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ethan for a long moment. I'll need to manage the books, she said. If we're going to do this properly, there have to be accounts. Supplies, scheduling, medical. It needs structure, or it falls apart. Then structure it, he said. I'll need help. You've got Ruth, he said. You've got Agnes. You've got Holt, who complains constantly and does everything anyway. He stood up. And you've got me. Clara stood up too. She crossed the kitchen, which wasn't far, and stood in front of him and looked up at him with the directness she brought to everything. The same directness that had looked at a forged court document and found the dead judge's name. The same directness that had faced a revolver in the kitchen at midnight and not moved. Why? She asked. Not the ranch, not the women. You and me. Why? He looked at her. Because you walked into my gate in a blizzard, he said. And the first thing you said wasn't help me. It was, I can work. And I've been watching you work ever since, and I ain't finished watching. She held his gaze. That's not an answer, she said. Yes, it is, he said. It just ain't the one you're used to. She stood there for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved that almost smile, the one that had been coming more easily lately, the ghost becoming gradually more solid, and she turned back to the table. All right, she said to the room. Let's figure out the north bunkhouse. They were 3 weeks into the renovation when the letter arrived. Holt brought it in from the post box and set it on the kitchen table without comment, which told Clara before she opened it that he'd looked at the return address and decided she should be sitting down. She wasn't sitting down. She opened it standing. It was from a law firm in Denver. Walter's law firm. Her hands went still. The letter was 2 pages. It was written in the formal, circuitous language of men who are paid to make simple things complicated, but the substance of it, when she cut through the language, was this. Walter's lawyers had identified a procedural error in the Helena hearing. A technicality in the way one piece of evidence had been entered. They were filing to have the Clearwater Survey conviction vacated. Not all the convictions, just one. But the Clearwater Survey was the cornerstone. Without it, the land fraud case against the Bennett Railroad interests dropped from 7 counts to 3. 3 counts a man with Walter's connections and Walter's lawyers could weather. Had weathered before. Clara set the letter down. She stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up and went to find Ethan. He read it twice. He read it the way he read everything completely without rushing, and when he was done, he set it on the workbench beside him and picked up the harness he'd been repairing and kept working. Well, Clara said. Well, what? Say something. I'm thinking. Ethan. He set the harness down. He turned to face her. The procedural error. Do you know what it is? The letter doesn't specify. Your 11 pages, he said. The original ones you wrote from memory. Were they entered into evidence as your testimony or as independent documentation? She went very still. Testimony, she said slowly. Which means they're subject to cross-examination challenges. She was already thinking past him, moving through it the way she moved through account ledgers, fast, precise, looking for the discrepancy. But the invoices, the actual invoice numbers I cited, those can be cross-referenced against the railroad's own records. Has anyone done that? No, she said. The marshal's office accepted my citation as sufficient for the hearing. Then that's the problem, he said. And that's the solution. The original railroad invoices, where are they filed? Denver, the Territorial Records Office. Can they be subpoenaed? She looked at him. Yes, she said. Yes, they can. She pressed her hands flat on the workbench. If the original invoices match what I cited, the procedural error doesn't matter. The documentation stands independent of my testimony. Then that's what we do, he said. It'll take time. Months, maybe. Then it takes months. Walter's lawyers will fight every step. Let them. He picked up the harness again. You've got 11 pages of memory that match the official invoices closely enough to convict him the first time. Those invoices exist somewhere. We find them, we send them to Marshall Cray, and Walter's lawyers run out of road. Clara looked at him. "You're not worried," she said. "I'm plenty worried," he said. "I just don't find it useful." She laughed. It was a real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that surprises the person it comes from. And Ethan stopped working and looked at her because it was still new enough that it caught him every time. Clara Bennett laughing like she wasn't measuring every gesture for safety. "I'll write to the marshal today," she said. "I'll wire Denver," he said. They separated her toward the house, him toward the stable, and Holt, who had been pretending to work on the fence 20 feet away and had heard the whole thing, watched them go and shook his head slowly. 11 years this man lived alone, he said to nobody in particular. And the woman showed up, and now he's wiring Denver. He went back to the fence. Took long enough? Okay. The Denver records took 4 months. 4 months of letters of legal responses of Walter's lawyers, raising objections that had to be answered, and objections to the answers that had to be answered in turn. 4 months of Clara at the kitchen table at night, not because she couldn't sleep anymore, but because there was work to do, building the case from its foundations, up with the patience of a woman who had learned that the truth doesn't always move fast, but it moves. Ruth stayed. She hadn't gone back to wherever she'd come from, and nobody asked her to. She took over the morning routines while Clara worked, and she taught Ellie how to bake bread, which Ellie did with tremendous enthusiasm and variable results. And the sound of the two of them in the kitchen on Saturday mornings became one of the fixed landmarks of the ranch, one of the things Ethan could locate himself by moving through the day. In September, the records arrived, all of it. 3 years of Bennett Railroad invoices from the Northern Corridor acquisition sent under federal subpoena to Marshall Cray's office, who sent copies to Clara and kept the originals under lock. She went through them in one night. Every figure she'd cited from memory matched. Every invoice number, every date, every payment to Amos Fitch, every falsified survey. 12 years of carrying those numbers in her head, running them over and over in the dark spaces between sleeping and waking, had produced something she hadn't fully believed until the moment she held the proof in her hands. She had been right. Every single time. She sat at the kitchen table as the sky outside began to pale toward morning, and she looked at the stack of matching documents, and she didn't feel triumph. She'd expected triumph. What she felt instead was something quieter. The settling of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped knowing it as weight, and just called it herself. She heard Ethan's door open. He came into the kitchen the way he always did in the early mornings, unhurried, clear-eyed, like a man who'd made peace with whatever the day was going to be before it arrived. He looked at her face first, the way he always looked at her face first before anything else in the room. "It matched," he said. Not a question. "All of it," she said. He nodded. He put the coffee on. He sat down across from her and waited while the coffee heated, and when it was ready he poured 2 cups and set one in front of her, and they sat in the early light with the documents between them, and nobody said anything for a while, and the silence was the most complete thing either of them had felt in a long time. "Ethan," she said. "I want to ask you something." "You're going to anyway." "That night," she said. "The night I arrived. Blizzard. Blood on my hands. No explanation. You opened the gate." She looked at him across the table. "And then every night after that you left me alone. You didn't push. You didn't ask for anything. You just—" She stopped. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you needed a door," he said finally. "Not a question, not a condition. Just a door that opened when you needed it open." He looked at his coffee. "I'd spent 11 years wishing someone had done that for Margaret, wishing there'd been someone who saw how hard she was working and didn't ask her to explain it first." His jaw shifted. "You showed up at my gate, and I thought, here's someone who knows how to survive. She just needs somewhere to do it." Clara held his gaze. "I'm not surviving anymore," she said quietly. He looked up. "No," he said. "You're not." She reached across the table. She put her hand over his deliberate steady, the way she did everything, and she held it there. He turned his hand over and held hers back. Outside, the ranch was beginning its morning. Holt's voice somewhere toward the stable. Ellie, who had started waking early for no discernible reason, moving in the hallway. The sound of the north bunkhouse where 2 women and 4 children were beginning another day in a place where the door had been opened for them. All of it surrounding them, all of it real. Walter's appeal was denied in November. The original convictions stood. With the documentary evidence from Denver, the procedural challenge collapsed entirely, and the Bennett Railroad land acquisitions in the Northern Corridor were formally invalidated by the territorial court. 300,000 acres of fraudulently obtained land went back into federal trust. 2 other men who'd been involved in the scheme, men whose names had appeared in the records alongside Walter's, faced their own proceedings. Walter Bennett went to the federal penitentiary in January. Clara received the notification on a Thursday morning. She read it at the kitchen table. She folded it once and set it face down and did not open it again. She didn't need to. She already knew what she needed to know. They married on the first Saturday of December in the ranch yard with snow on the ground, and Holt standing up for Ethan, and Ruth standing up for Clara, and Ellie standing between them, holding both their hands, because she'd decided that was where she belonged, and no one had seen fit to argue with her. The preacher from the valley came. So did Agnes and her children. So did the 2 women from the north bunkhouse, one of whom cried steadily throughout the ceremony and apologized repeatedly, and was told repeatedly to stop apologizing. It wasn't a large wedding. It was the exactly right size. When the preacher asked Ethan if he took this woman, he said yes, in the same voice he used for everything. The flat, certain voice of a man who had thought it through and was finished thinking. And when he asked Clara, she looked at Ethan and said, "I do," in the voice of a woman who understood exactly what those 2 words cost, and was choosing them with full knowledge of the price. Ellie squeezed both their hands at the same time. Nobody said anything about that. Some things don't need saying. The years that followed were not without hardship, because the years that follow are never without hardship, and anyone who tells you different is selling something. There were difficult winters and hard seasons, and years when the books were close enough to make Clara's pencil hesitate at the numbers. There were women who came to the ranch broken and left still fragile, and women who came fragile and left transformed, and women who came and stayed because they'd found something here they hadn't found anywhere else. Ellie grew up. She grew up in the particular way of children raised by people who have survived hard things and chosen on the other side of them to be generous with a fearlessness that wasn't recklessness and a tenderness that wasn't weakness. She learned accounting from her mother. She learned patience from Ethan. She learned that a gate that opens is more powerful than a gate that locks, and she spent her whole life proving it. She became a lawyer. The valley changed around the ranch, the way valleys change: more people, more roads, the slow encroachment of the century turning over into something new. But the coal ranch stayed. The north bunkhouse expanded twice. The kitchen table where so many hard conversations had been held and so many hard decisions made was replaced once when the wood gave out, and then kept for the rest of their lives, because Clara said the new one didn't have the same weight. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. And every winter night in the years that followed, when the snow came down, the way it came down in Montana, without apology, heavy and complete visitors who stayed at the ranch would sometimes hear it from the direction of the barn. A woman's voice, soft and low, moving through the dark, the way music moves through dark spaces, filling what it finds. Not frightened, not hiding, not praying for forgiveness she'd already given herself, just singing. Because Clara Bennett had learned in the long years between a blizzard and a barn, and a man who opened his gate before he asked any questions, that music was not the sound of a woman suffering. It was the sound of a woman who had survived everything they used against her, and built something stronger from the wreckage, and was still standing. And a man who had spent 11 years believing that love was something you buried with the people you lost, had learned from the only woman who ever drove a kitchen knife into his floorboards at midnight that love isn't buried by loss. It waits. Patient as Montana winter, certain as the spring that always follows. and it opens the gate.